Hi guys, welcome to this video on the Vue 3 Composition API. Vue 3 has unlocked brand new APIs for us. We're going to take a look at refs, reactivity, Vuex, and lots more in depth when it comes to the Composition API. If you like this video and I've got loads more free content for you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that ding dong bell, give us a nice big thumbs up. It'll be very much appreciated. Let's get on with the video. So why would we want to use the new Vue 3 Composition API? I first want to address that Vue 3 is not replacing Vue 2. In other words, you can still write components the way you would from Vue 2 in Vue 3, with some slight modifications here and there. However, you can overall write your components the same way. The Composition API is graceful. It's not a replacement, so you can gracefully upgrade your components if you wish, or you can leave them alone. The second thing is, why would you want to do it? Well, when you see a composer that has lots of notes on his sheet. All those notes add up to a tune on that sheet, and that's composable. Well, I want you to think the same way here. Now, at the moment, if I look at this component, it's fairly large. It's got quite a bit of logic in there. And of course, when I'm creating methods that deal with that same property and computed properties that are dealing with the same data, I kind of want my data more composable, more closer together, more well-defined. What if I could actually do that? So for example, in this case, instead of segregating out my code into computed or watched, let's just say I can move the data closer to the methods and the computed property. Now, all of my logic is coupled together, and I can do that for everything. So instead of me changing something and potentially breaking it, or I see all of the parts of the component to deal with that data, now I can with Composition API, because I can move things closer together, and that really helps with readability. Not only does Composition API make this more readable, especially with larger and more complex components, which will always exist in the SPA world, it allows for more reactivity control. So this is something we'll tuck into later, but what you will be able to do is you'll be able to control the reactivity. So the first thing we're going to do is import what we need for the Composition API. The first thing will be importing ref, reactive, and computed from Vue itself. So now that I've imported this from the Vue library, I can now use this in the Composition API of my component. The next thing I want to do is create a setup method within my component. And now we're going to transfer our data, computed, and methods into the Composition API. So the first thing we'll do with the setup method is use the ref function. Now, the ref function is used for basic properties, primitive properties like strings, numbers, booleans such as true and false, anything like that. A standard property that you would normally see in your data, we can transfer over. So we are going to create a constant, and trust me, you can still edit the value of these properties, but I set them as constants initially. So constants will be first name, middle name, and last name. They are all string types, therefore I can set them equal to ref and then pass in the default value. The next thing that I need to do is convert my address object. Now, the address property here is not actually a primitive value. It's an object. It's a more complex value type. This is where reactive comes in. So I'm going to set a constant, then I'm going to call reactive, and in there we're going to have an object. Next up we have computed. So again, I'm just going to create some constants, and by the way, I'm creating constants because whether you're using ref or reactive, they're actually returning objects here, and I don't actually want that bit to change. So I'm setting these to constants. So we're going to have constant full name, formatted address, and then we're going to call the computed method on those constants and make that equal to the value. And of course, the value that we're passing into computed is the function that we want to run when we want to display these computed props. So at the moment, this won't actually work because this is not populated. You see, setup is called before the component is initialized. So before you turn the ignition and set everything up, setup is running before that, hence the word setup. So we have to work with our properties a little bit differently in this instance. We cannot use the this dot. What we must do is target that proxy object that's created, and we'll talk more about that later. And you target it with the const var or let name that you've given it, and then you use dot value. That will ensure that when you're using refs, you can use dot value. Now with reactive, it's a little bit different. You don't need to bother with dot value with the reactive, but what you do need to do is access those properties directly. Since I've set this as a constant, what I want to do is make sure that it's constantly reactive, and therefore I don't want to replace the object. What I want to do is target each individual property and reset it. That is something you need to bear in mind when it comes to computed or methods or any sort of execution context within setup. And that's how you access refs, is you use .value, and then for reactive, you target each individual property. The final thing is a method. Now, a method doesn't need any sort of special hook or any sort of reference or reactivity. A method is not actually that reactive. And then all we need to do is actually just move the method into the setup. And then what we need to do is create a return statement. Now, whatever you return in this object, it will actually produce that in the component. So you can privatize things at this point. I'd like to say there is a nice caveat to this. You can actually create certain private properties or very private computed or whatever it is, and not actually have that exported out into the component space for whatever reason that may be. So you can actually have a bit more encapsulation in your components. So all I'm going to do is use the ES6 syntax and then just use the name of the constant, let, or var. And what that does is it will use that as the key name, and then it will go fetch the value and assign it. So you can actually create an alias here. So instead of first name, you could create the key my name and then have the value as first name, that reactive property there. So that is possible in this case, if you'd like to do that. So another nice little caveat, but normally for the most part you don't need to. Now it's also very important that when you start to see things missing, you see properties missing and so forth, and they just won't render in your template, you then know that you haven't actually returned it from the setup method. I will warn you of that because it's guaranteed to trip you up. So once I have exported out my properties, computed methods, and so forth, what I'd like to do now is actually compose my component a little bit better. At the moment, we still really haven't improved anything that much. So what I want to do is move first name, middle name, last name closer to the full name, for example. So I'm keeping code closer together and also the set default method, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm grouping code together, and I'll do the same with the address. So this is where it's more important to sort of understand how grouping things together will make it easier to read and clearer to understand. Now imagine this component was quite a bit more complex than this one. This will definitely come in handy. I'm not having to scroll up and down the page in this giant object to try and find the property or whatever. I'm encapsulating things even further, keeping things closer together so that I can discover the code and discover any dependencies, or thus anything that I'm changing that will change a dependency, likewise and vice versa. Just keeps things nice and simple. And of course, we've only just scratched the surface here. There's many other things such as watched, and there's tons of things to ref and reactivity that we have not discovered here, but we will be doing in just a moment in this video. But right now, what I want to do is save that out. We've converted our component into this composition API, and you'll see that my whole application is still working exactly as expected. Great. The first step is done. We've been exposed to what the composition API is. We've seen a little bit of the caveats and the benefits, a little bit of the drawbacks, which is a bit more verbose, but it really is a nice little API, a cherry on top for Vue.js. Next up, we have components and their lifecycle hooks. So components have life cycles, and as you cycle through life, you have moments in your life or key pivotal points. Well, it's the same thing with components. They, during their lifetime, during their existence within your application, have certain points, and those points will trigger certain things. So we need those hooks, we need those lifecycle hooks at certain points when building our application. So the first difference between Vue 2 and Vue 3 is the before create and created hooks have completely gone. Those two hooks have actually been replaced by this setup method. But then we have the rest of the hooks that we can take a look at. So first of all, we have to import all of these hooks. That will be on before mount, on mounted, on before update, on updated, on before unmount, on unmounted, on error captured, on render tracked, on render triggered. So as you can see, Vue 3 is actually now introducing so much more into the lifecycle hooks already. Some of them you will recognize from Vue 2, but there's even more here. So now what I'm going to do is the smart thing, which is do it all in one go. On before mount, on mounted, on before update, on updated, on before unmount, on unmount, on error captured, on render tracked, on render triggered. And I'm going to put all of those hooks into the setup method, and then we're just going to log something out to the console. Now, if you still want to access properties and so forth within this component, you would use the way that we used the hooks API before, where you'd use .value with ref, and with reactive, you would just target the property. And before we begin looking at hooks, what we first want is an analogy to understand hooks a little bit better, and it's something you use in your everyday life, such as a USB dongle. I want you to think of that USB dongle as a Vue component, and your computer as the Vue library. Now, there's a certain process that follows, and certain hooks and functionality that you can hook into in the lifetime of you using that USB dongle with your computer. For example, you mount that dongle, you unmount the dongle, and when you mount the dongle, you can update information on the dongle, and you can cause other things to happen during the life cycle of the use of that dongle. So we're going to use that analogy. And of course, if this were to be a real computer, it would be like thousands of USB ports everywhere and loads of components or USB dongles being plugged in and out, in and out, in and out all the time, and we can hook into that functionality and do what we need to do as programmers. So the first hook was actually created a while ago, which was setup. Now, this is when you first push the pen drive into the computer. At the moment, the computer may not know every single thing about that piece of hardware, that dongle you plugged in. But what it will do is it will say, right, that setup hook will be triggered. And that is when, before all the configurable options and so forth happen, right? Because you're creating those options, you're creating properties and reactive properties in the setup hook. So this is like at the very earliest stage you can enter into a component. You've just plugged it in. Next up, we have on before mount, and that will be called right before mounting of the DOM begins. So before it renders the template, what it will do is call before mounted. This is great if you want to prepare some sort of data or call some data from a server somewhere and have that prepared before you render the DOM for the first time. I look at this like now, as you plug the USB pen drive in, it's got the configurable options. It knows what options there are there, but maybe we want to do something initially before we mount that pen drive or that component. The next one is on mounted. This is called when the instance has been mounted. So that's when you finally plugged it in and the user can see it pop up on the screen for the first time. When that partition is mounted from that pen drive, you actually see that partition in your file explorer. This is great for them when saying, right, when we're ready, we can then load in some additional data or do some additional actions. Then we have on before update. Now this is called when the data has changed, so some reactive data such as a property, and before the DOM is re-rendered. So before your template's re-rendered, some property has changed, and we can hook into that, and before I render any sort of update to the user, I might want to get or perform an action like that before the user sees anything. So that's what onBeforeUpdate does. And then onUpdated, well, with onUpdated, that's called when the reactive data has changed, just like before, but the DOM has finished rendering. So there was a reactive change, and also the DOM has rendered this time. Next up, we have onBeforeUnmount. So we've mounted this, we've had updated life cycles, we've updated this dongle, but now we want to unmount it. Well, I look at this process as the eject process, or the safely remove that pen drive, or safely remove this component process. Now obviously this isn't a requirement where it is with a USB dongle. Obviously with the before unmount, that will go ahead and trigger before the component, before that USB is tugged out of the machine. So you still have access to the properties. Maybe you want to very quickly save some of the properties information out to local storage, or do some kind of check before you unmount that component. Then you have the onUnmounted hook. This hook will trigger as if it were to be that you've actually physically pulled it out of the machine. You've removed that entire USB thumb drive, you remove the component, it's been completely destroyed, and then of course Vue, the computer, will say, aha, this guy is completely removed from me, he's gone, and that's when that hook will trigger, which is onUnmounted. Then we have error captured. Now, error captured will be triggered when any of the descending components error, and it will be captured at that level, and it basically bubbles up. So if you think of a bubble rises, an event rises, information rises. So let's say we have lots of nested components, but the parent component will be able to have the error captured, and it will capture any errors from its descendants, and even those descendants and the descendants of those descendants, right? It's a whole tree structure. Then we also have onRender tracked. So this is called when a reactive dependency, whether that be a property in your component, is being accessed in the render function during render. So if someone's accessing a property during or in the render function, it's going to trigger this particular hook. This is helpful to see which dependencies are being tracked for debugging purposes. Most of this will be used for debugging purposes. And then you have onRender triggered. So that is when you've made a change and that has caused the renderer to trigger, and it says triggered past tense, which means that it's finished triggering that sort of render call. So you do onRender triggered, and then it will call that hook, and then you can define your information in there. Now the final part to this is something that we have to understand about keep alive. Now you might not have heard of keep alive in Vue, but what keep alive does is pretty much what it says. It keeps a component alive, and this opens up new hook possibilities such as onActivated and onDeactivated. So let's add onActivated and onDeactivated, and again I can add that once I've imported it into the setup method. But let's take a look at a real world example of what keep alive does. So in the documentation we can see that in this first instance we have tabs, and these tabs load blog posts. Now each time I click on one of those, it's going to mount the blog post component, create an instance of that component, and then when I click on the next one, it's going to unmount that component and then mount the new component. Now sometimes that isn't very productive. Sometimes you want to cache your components. So in order for you to potentially not load in more data or make initial requests to the server for this blog post, for example, if it's dynamic, maybe you want to store it in cache, keep it alive whilst the user's on that page in those tabs. So we wrap that in keep alive, and now when I click on the blog posts, it's not going to just unmount. It will mount the first blog post. I click the next link. Now unmounted will not trigger because we're not unmounting. We're not destroying that instance. We are leaving it in cache. And then we're mounting a new component. So at the moment, the only way I can really trigger something here is with mounted, and if I go back to the previous post, nothing will trigger, not mounted or unmounted, even if I go off it, because it's still kept alive. Now, if I navigate away from the page, yes, it will do mounted and unmounted again. However, during the life of these tabs, they are being kept alive in cache. That's where on activated and on deactivated come in. So when I now have the hooks on there, even though the component is kept alive, every time I show that component from cache, it will trigger on activated, and every time I hide that component, but it's still kept alive, that will then be on deactivated. Now let's very quickly move on to watchers. Now I didn't want to overwhelm you initially, and of course we're learning a ton of things, but now it's time to learn about watchers. So at the moment we didn't have any watchers, but let's say we did, and we wanted to watch the first name, middle name, and last name. Well, with the classical way of doing things, you would have to write watch, and then you'd have to watch the first name, then the middle name, and then the last name. And then, of course, if you were to write some code to perform some functionality based upon those changes, you would have to repeat that functionality 3 times. Or you would have to turn that into a method and then call that method in the watchers. Now, this is very unproductive. It's not nice and it's not clean. And the Composition API offers us a great advantage over the classical model here that really does boost productivity and make us write much cleaner code. So the first thing we're going to do is import watch from the Vue library. Now that I've imported it, I can go into setup and we can create a watcher. And then the first argument that I'm going to pass is what I want to watch for. So we'll start with 1 so far. So the first thing that I want to watch is first name. The second argument is the callback function. Now the callback function has the previous and then the new value passed in automatically, and so we're going to define those parameters and then we're going to create the execution context. It's just going to log out to the console and then tell us that the first name has changed. And there we're able to see the output. So this is really great, but it's not really added much advantage on top of the old API. But now let's say that I actually want to watch multiple sources like I was before. Well, the first argument will now need to be an array, and that array will be first name, middle name, and last name. I can now watch all of those values in one watch function call. You can see how this is quite a bit nicer. Then, when fetching the data, I can pull that previous and next value out for each one of the watchers. So I'm watching 3 properties here, and I want 3 sets of previous and next values. Again, these are optional, but I'm demonstrating all the features here. So I can look at the previous and next value of name, middle name, and last name. And I just give those parameters names, and we go ahead and take a look at that inside of the function. And we can even print out the previous and next values in the console, print out all of those previous and next values on any one of those. And you'll be able to see that when I make a change to either first name, last name, or the middle name, then it will automatically trigger this watcher, and we only have one execution context with all of the data that I need, and it's very simplistic. Now hopefully you can see how this is actually far better than what we had before in the classical way of writing components. Now there's also something brand new out the box called WatchEffect. Now I want you to think of this like the computed version of watch. So with computed properties, whenever you use property, it automatically deals with that dependency injection. So if I use first name in computed, every time I make a modification to the first name property, it automatically will trigger that computed property. Well, this is what WatchEffect is. So watch means that you have to explicitly say what you want to watch. However, WatchEffect is where if you use some property and it detects that, it will automatically detect that as a dependency and then trigger that watch. So let's take a look at this now. I want to first of all import WatchEffect from the Vue library. Then I want to call WatchEffect within the setup function. Then what I want to do is create an execution context, create a function, and within that function I'm going to console.log out the first name, middle name, and last name. Now it's automatically done that dependency injection. I don't need to define what I want to watch for. The WatchEffect will say, okay, my execution context is wanting access to first name, middle name, and last name properties. Therefore, that is the dependency injection. So when I don't need to explicitly define what I'm watching for, I can use WatchEffect, basically making it like the computed of the watch world. It's automatically detecting dependencies and then triggering this WatchEffect when those dependencies are changed. And of course, when you see this in your browser, you will be astounded when I change the first, middle, or last name. It goes ahead and triggers that, prints it out in the console, and hey presto, WatchEffect is now in effect. Next up, we're going to take a look at the ref and reactivity very much in depth, but in order for people to really understand what Vue is doing under the hood, I need to explain proxy objects first. What does proxy actually mean? What it means is that we are acting on behalf of someone else. If someone is acting on proxy, you could look at a solicitor is acting on proxy on behalf of the client that he's defending. Well, it's very much the same thing with proxy objects. You see, you give Vue your objects, but your objects are plain standard JavaScript objects. But what Vue does is create something called proxy objects. So it actually takes your object, all of its values and so forth, and then it adds this proxy object that will watch for mutations on any one of those properties and so forth. This allows Vue to become reactive. Whenever you update that string or update that object, it will trigger the event and that event will then update the DOM. And Vue does this automatically for you behind the scenes so that you just put in what you want and then Vue takes care of the reactivity part of the application. So this is what we mean by proxy objects. So now that we know about proxy objects, the first thing we need to discover is actually how to pull a value out of refs in the Composition API. You cannot just log out the actual reference because that's an object, and many people may be going, why did I use constant? Well, the proxy object I want to stay constant. So when I do the console.log, I point to first name and then I do .value, and that will actually pull out the value of that property. Now, if you need to assign a value to that property, not the proxy object, but the value, and then use the assignment operator. Now let's just say that maybe we're going to pass this data up to a data layer. Maybe it's a product and a cart, and what we actually want is to send the product to the API layer. Now you don't want to send a proxy object to an API layer that's a proxy object. A proxy object is only useful for Vue, but if you want to actually get the value out, sure, you could point to .value. But however, you can use the unref function as well. So first of all, import unref, and then you can go to the setup function and point to, let's say, first name. And what that will do is it will unreference, it will take out the value out of the proxy object, it will strip everything out of that reference that's to do with the proxy and just leave the reference itself, either as its primitive value or the value that you've given it. Next up, we have the toRef. So first of all, we want to import that from Vue, and then we want to go into the setup. And then what we want to do is toRef allows you to create a reference, a proxy reference object that comes from a reactive object. So we can see with address, this is a reactive object. It's a proxy object that wraps an object, and it's going to deeply watch all those properties and it will update. So toReference allows us to pull out a property from, for example, address, a reactive object, pull out, let's say, line 1, and have that as a separate reference, but it keeps the link to the reactive object. So I'm going to create a new property called line1. Then what we need to do is export that using the return object of the setup method. We go up, and now to prove that it maintains its reactivity, we're going to change the v model of the address line1 to the new line1 property. So now when I save this and I modify address line1, notice how that v model is actually assigning back to the line1 property. However, when I update it, you'll also see the address objects property line1 also update. So we're able to create almost like an alias or symlink to our properties within reactive objects. The next one is isRef. isRef can be imported again from Vue. And then this is actually really simple. You pass it in a argument, and it will determine if that argument is maybe a standard value, so it's not reactive, it will return false. If it returns true, it means that it is a reactive object. It's a proxy object. Now, even though it's recommended to use reactive, you can actually use an object with reference. Now, when you use an object, it will deeply watch, and this is by default with Vue. Vue always wants to deeply watch all the nested properties. So if you've got objects inside of objects inside of objects, it's going to wrap each one of those objects with a proxy object. Now, this adds to memory consumption, it adds to power consumption. Everything you do that adds to the operation of anything is going to have a knock-on effect. And with the old way of doing things, the Vue 2 way, you had no control over that. It would always do that. But what we would like to do is potentially control this to the point where we don't really want to nest all of the embedded objects with proxy objects. However, if I actually update anything within it in that shallow reference, that isn't triggering a re-render, and WatchEffect won't trigger, because it's not a deeply referenced object. It's just watching .value. But anything inside of .value, that object, it's not going to trigger. Therefore, WatchEffect will not trigger. So let's just say, for argument's sake, I had really big objects and I didn't really want to make it all deeply reactive. However, when I do make changes to shallow reference objects, then maybe I want to trigger an update, and that's where triggerRef comes in. So all you got to do is, first of all, import the triggerRef from the Vue library, and then you want to do triggerRef and then pass it the shallow reference that you created, that property, and then it will actually trigger that reactive change that we're looking for. So the next thing is looking at reactive, and we can basically just take a lot of the knowledge we've just learned from refs and then move that over to reactive. So first of all, reactive we've already used with the address object. So reactive is basically taking an object and then making a replica of it. By default, again, it's deeply proxied, so you can tell by the fact we've got shallow reactive and so forth that we can get rid of some of that reactivity if we don't need it, which is another benefit of this API over the Vue 2 API. We get to control what's reactive. So in this case, we passed it an object and it created a duplicate. Now you can also create read-only objects. Read-only objects are actually really good, potentially in methods or in something that you might not want to create adverse changed effects on. So read-only is pretty good. All you've got to do is create it and then say read-only and then pass it the original object. So this will be the address object in this instance. And what it will do is it will make sure that it's all still reactive, everything else, but it's read-only, so you can't go in there and start affecting things. If you do, you will get a warning. It's pretty much self-explanatory. It's creating a read-only instance of the prior reactive object. Now, if the original object is updated, such as the address, and if that object's updated, the read-only one will also stay up to date with the original object. It's just that you can't modify the original object with the read-only instance. Next up is proxy and is reactive. I mean, this is pretty much two birds with one stone here. Is proxy will check to see if it's actually a proxy object, which we now know what that is. And also you have is reactive. Now, is reactive will say, is that particular value, is that particular property, it could be a deeply nested property and so forth, is that particular property reactive? Will it react if I update it? So these are nice checks to see whether there's reactivity on something you're about to update. Next up is read-only, which again is self-explanatory. You pass it an object and it basically says, is that a read-only object that was created with the Reactive API? The next one is toRaw. So what toRaw will do is it will strip out the proxy object, just like with the ref. You could send it to its raw functionality basically. So you're stripping out all of the proxy stuff and you're just returning the raw object that you initially inputted, and it will get rid of everything else. Next up is mark raw. Now mark raw is actually really important because sometimes, and I've had instances of this, where you don't want to create a deeply watched object. You just don't want it. It's not necessary. So mark raw will make sure that throughout the entire application's lifespan and use of that particular value that you passed into mark raw, it will never be allowed to be turned into a proxy object. It won't allow that to happen. So that is why mark raw is really good. Even if you try to put that inside of a reactive object, even deeply nest it inside of a reactive object, it will not make that reactive. Raw is raw. It says it's raw JavaScript. It's the raw value that I've given it. I never want you to turn that into a proxy. That can be actually very useful. And finally, we have shallow reactive, which you can imagine what that will do. Just like with shallow ref. So with shallow ref, it only watched the value property. But if I gave that value property an object, for example, it wouldn't try to deeply proxy that. Well, it's the same thing here. So I can have address, for example, and if I make that shallow reactive, there won't be actually any difference. It will still watch all of the properties, but only on that shallow level, only one step in, right? But when we start going more nested, so let's add an object into the address. Now that object that I've just created, the key that holds it, if I assign a new object to that key or a new value, whether it be a string or whatever, that will be reactive. However, everything that's nested inside of there, that's deeply nested, that's not going to be proxied. It's not going to be converted into a proxy object because it's a shallow reactive. This can actually be, again, really great for trimming out unnecessary calls, unnecessary render triggers. We want to keep things down to a minimum when it comes to reactivity so that only the things that really need to be reactive will be reactive. And then the final one is shallow read only, which you can only imagine what that one is. So we're creating an instance, a proxy object on the main one, just like shallow reactive, where it'll only look at those very shallow keys, but anything nested, any nested keys and nested values, they will not be reactive and they won't be watched. And this time it's read only. So you can pass it in a previous object, or you could create a new object with shallow read only. It's up to you. And it will only allow you to read it. It will not let you do anything else. And as I said again, it will only be reactive on those very shallow keys. The nested keys it will not react to. And even if the original changes, and let's say the original is a fully reactive object, the shallow read-only will not react to deeply nested changes. So if there's any changes on the shallow keys, it will update the shallow read-only if you've created a duplicate copy, but it will not trigger anything if you've got a deeply nested key from the original object, and even if that's deeply watched, the one from shallow read-only will not be triggered. And with the setup lifecycle hook, you will notice that we can also pass in two parameters. We can define those parameters. The first one will be the props. So if you have props coming in from a parent component to your component, this one on this level, then you can go ahead and use props. And the second parameter will contain the AppContext. This is useful for a number of things, such as attributes or ATTRS, emit if I want to emit something up, expose, and slots. So we have access to all of those things with these two parameters. Next up, we just want to use the Vuex store. So I'm not going to go too much into Vuex, but that's where your application state exists. You can do this by importing the use store from Vuex. Once you've imported that, all you need to do in your setup function is I would create a constant called store and then just call useStore. This will give you access to the state of the application, all of the modules, and also the dispatch method. And also, if you wanted to map the getters and so forth, then I will just do it the traditional way, because don't forget that this is just a complementary API. And so what I will do is just basically create computed on the normal way I would do it, and then I would just map the getters in there like I normally would with Vue 2. And that way, everybody's a winner. You can still map all your getters. It doesn't have to all be this brand new API, but if you start implementing it and influencing yourself with that new API, I guarantee you that at some point it's going to benefit you, especially in large-scale applications where logic does start to creep out and get rather complex rather quickly. And you'll find that mostly in the e-commerce sphere. Alright guys, thank you for watching this video, and to summarize, we've taken a look at all of the new Vue 3 APIs, such as refs, reactive, Vuex, and all of the hooks that's involved with the brand new Vue 3 API. Alright guys, so I hope you've enjoyed this video. Hit that subscribe button and join the Avelx family. It will be much appreciated. And then also join the newsletter, which is also linked in the description down below, so that you can get the source code of these videos quick and easy, and also jam-packed with more developer content and free goodies. So thank you for watching, and if you'd like to watch some more stuff, go ahead and take a look at these courses above me and take a look at the latest stuff that we have to offer.